Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Leveraging Streaming Data Through Automation. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Our featured speakers are John Myers, Managing Research Director at Enterprise Management Associates, and Neil Barton, Chief Technology Officer at WhereScape. John has nearly 20 years of experience working in areas related to business analytics and business intelligence in professional services consulting and product development roles. Neil has more than 20 years of experience focused on software architecture, data warehousing, and business intelligence, including positions at Oracle Australia. He is also co-inventor of 3 U.S. patents related to business intelligence software solutions. And before I hand things over to today's featured speakers, I wanted the audience to know that you can log your questions anytime by using the Q&A functionality located in the left-hand column of your screen. We will be dedicating the last 10 or 15 minutes to answering your questions. Also, today's event is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email from EMA that will include the on-demand recording as well as some additional resources, so I hope you will check that out. You are also invited to log any questions or comments either during the event or after via Twitter. I've included some Twitter handles and hashtags here. John and Neil will be checking those out for your commentary. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our first featured speaker, John Myers. John?
Well, thank you very much, Raleigh. It's a great opportunity to be speaking with Neil. He and I have been working quite a bit over the last year or so, and it's great to be able to talk about some of these concepts that we've been developing. So in terms of our agenda, we're going to talk a bit about the drivers behind the growth of streaming and some of those streaming usage scenarios, the challenges that streaming data presents that you might not find in that kind of a batch environment, and the value of automation techniques and technologies that can really be applied in these environments, and how we can get the benefits of those particular automation techniques for streaming data pipelines. And then at the end, Neil's going to do a great job of bringing us up to speed on where WhereScape is in terms of applying their automation qualifications to the streaming environment and how they're able to achieve some of the things that I'm going to talk about in the first half of the presentation. In terms of kind of looking at what is driving the growth of streaming in our organizations is, one of the things that I talk quite a bit about is the area of data-driven cultures and data-driven strategies. And in the past, we have had environments where we looked at data as being if you will, a backward-looking kind of record, if you will, of what happens in our business. But data-driven organizations are looking at the ways of how do we take the data, put it into the beginning of the business model, how do we integrate it at the start of something that we're trying to do so that they can derive competitive advantage. So rather than trying to adjust sales targets or inventory levels, looking at where we were in arrears, saying how can we look at our predicted demand gen for 1, 2, 3 months out, and how can we try to bring our supply chain up to speed? How can we apply cross-sell, upsell opportunities with our customers to try to either clear some of the backlog we may have in inventory, things of that nature? But as part of this, we're really seeing organizations say we want to take data and really inject it into our business models and our processes at the beginning, as opposed to simply looking at them at the end. Now, a lot of organizations might go, how many people are looking at streaming and IoT and things of that nature? Well, in 2 separate end user research studies that EMA has done, we found that 85% of respondents were looking at IoT as part of their organizational strategy in one, and 72% were looking at streaming data as part of the organizational strategy of what they're doing in another. So it's not something that organizations are sitting there kind of going, yeah, we're thinking about it, perhaps, things of that nature. This is something that's widespread. Organizations are seeing that particular value and how it can impact their business. Now, what they're going to be using those streaming data sources for are kind of across the board. But if you take a look at this, a lot of these strike at either increasing revenues, whether we're talking about new business models or new product development. How do we manage better our costs, either in terms of operational productivity or process efficiency? And then how can we really impact the supply chain, the inputs and the outputs of, if we're in the manufacturing business, you know, the things that are the inputs to our manufacturing process. If we are the end user of that, how do we get that to our resellers or retail venues at the right time and the right place, so that we can continue to make sure that people get the right experiences that they're looking for. And we're seeing this come across all of these different areas. Specifically, we're seeing organizations look at how do they pull streaming data, not just from some of those traditional devices like IoT, as we see in that lower corner of streaming devices, whether that be connected fleet, whether that be utilities, either power generation or extraction, as you see there in that example for oil heads and things of that nature. But how do we look at, say, real-time applications as people are using our systems to order goods and services, to get those fulfilled to those particular people and having those payments go through? How do we look at those components and say, is this the type of customer that we want to extend credit to? So rather than them paying in advance, they would pay in arrears. And what kind of risk do we have associated with that? What types of potential cases for fraud are we seeing in some of our fulfillment processes or our payment processes? But in each of those areas, we're able to pull real-time streaming data out of that. And then another area, which is, you know, not just for online, if you will, clickstream type of path analysis, but going out to the mobile device and being able to understand not just how we're looking at things in terms of the ability to look at on the desktop, but saying how do we look at location-based services, how do we look at how people are using those mobile applications, whether they be for entertainment, information. A lot of organizations are pushing ordering and fulfillment all the way out onto the edge of those mobile devices and really making that available. But in each of these cases, we've got information and data that are streaming into our environments, and sometimes we just want to use it for an operational perspective to understand customer experience, to understand do we have uptime, things of that nature. But in a lot of these instances, organizations are bringing this data together to an analytical environment and are able to inject it into their business models as well. Now, in terms of all the good stuff that I just talked about in that beginning section about, you know, the great benefits, people are interested, things of that nature, there are challenges that take place that are associated with streaming environments and things of that nature. So, you know, when we think about streaming, we're not thinking about traditional batch types of environments where we kind of collect everything every 5 minutes or every 15 minutes or once an hour. We're looking at a steady trickle of information in real time as it comes from those sources into our environment. And some of the obstacles that we've seen in terms of end user research that's been performed here at EMA is, you know, the quality and reliability of the data. Are we getting the right information that we need, and are we getting it at the right times? Oftentimes you'll see that there are issues trying to bring data from where it resides into whether an operational, an exploratory, or an analytical environment. Do we have the right connectivity to those data sources? How do we look at the ability to get that information where we're looking? And then that third one is that inability to ingest or store that information. Streaming, as I've said, is kind of a stream of data that kind of goes through the environment or the framework that you have available to you. But a lot of times, if you are unable to land that data in a data management platform, whether that be Hadoop, a relational platform, NoSQL, you're going to run into issues to say, how do we look at it historically? You'll have that ability to look at it in the stream or in that point in time, but you'll have issues if you can't use it to develop a machine learning model if you're going to look at it from that perspective. If you want to explore that information to find new insights, etc., because trying to do that with just a streaming environment is much like trying to capture the Mississippi River as you get up to that point. You know, you can watch the river, you can manage the river to a certain extent, but you really can't pull it all together and try to do something with it. You really have to have an ability to store and ingest that information. Now, in some end user research, we found that over 10% of our respondents who had streaming practices being important to what they're doing spent 40% of their time on data prep types of practices. Now, what they're trying to do is to react to the different numbers and formats of data that are going to come through. One of the primary formats that we're seeing in terms of streaming is the JSON format. And while it is a standard, if you will, it's not a set and rigid standard. It's more like a standard for the formatting of the data. And you can have flexibility in those areas. And as we see application developers who are looking to add new fields into some of the apps that they're looking for, a lot of times they'll add things in because they go, hey, this is going to make sense for what we're trying to do with the application. Sometimes they don't think about the if you will, the impacts downstream if we're trying to store that data or do other things with that. Another area is when we look at the IoT world. While we would like to say that IoT is now here, we're still developing sensors, we're still developing devices that'll be part of this, and we're seeing different frameworks for people to bring that data in. Now, while they may all be based on JSON, we may have a set that for one particular manufacturer that looks one way, a different revolution of the software in another area will have something different. So a lot of these streaming organizations are spending their time trying to manage the collection and the data preparation of this information as it comes into their environments. Another thing that we take a look at, we saw that nearly 40% of our respondents, again, who had a focus on streaming practices, were able to do their data prep within one day, which meant that they really had to get things going quickly, which is a little bit different than what we've seen in terms of our batch environments because they had a slower rate of change. They are having that ability to say, okay, we got to be able to react to this, and because we're bringing in these streaming data sources, we need to be able to adjust to them quickly in those environments. And so they have to do their turnarounds relatively fast in terms of how they're handling those types of approaches. And then the next one was, if we are going to put some type of predictive analytics or machine learning environment on the backside of this, we found that 6 out of 10 of our respondents, where they were making changes to their analytical models, if not weekly, they were doing it daily. So they've got a lot of not just data change, but how do we have that, make use of that data in terms of how do we look at changing those models and the changing requirements that are going to go along with that. And again, I think this is a product of the newness of a lot of these streaming environments and what people want to do with them, but I also think it shows the originality and the vision that a lot of the data science and data teams that have access to this, they're really looking at it from the perspective of how do these things work? How can we find a better way of doing it? And really goes to the heart of that data-driven type of mindset to say, how do we take this, develop our competitive advantage? Now, one of the ways, or a couple of the ways that we really take a look at this is to be able to capture this metadata and this data lineage to enable a lot of the change that has come before us. So if we don't have a common environment of metadata capture, then we're going to run into issues because then not only are we trying to coordinate data, but we're trying to coordinate the metadata about this information. If we can have it in one environment, it really helps us out. Another one is data lineage. as we have looked in our traditional environments, it was relatively easy to say the data lineage. It came from ERP, hit the ETL tool, went to our enterprise data warehouse. And that was a relatively easy data lineage to look at there. But now when we look at these streaming environments, we've got them on the creation of the events where they are. How do they move through a streaming architecture, whether that be Kafka or one of the Hadoop variants of that? How do they hit to a particular location and looking at that? And this is really kind of telling us how fresh is the data, how many hops or changes have been made to the data by the time when it was generated or born until someone is taking a look at it for an operational or an analytical perspective. And without these types of components, we run into issues with being able to manage that change and that flexibility that I talked about in the preceding components. Now, for folks who have heard me talk about this in the past, I'm a big proponent of the concept of using automation techniques in the development of our analytical environments, because I think it's the way that we're really going to be able to scale to meet the challenges that we have with our current environment. So, I think one of the keys to this is to create a centralized architecture. I think many of us have seen either the horror stories, either from the front lines, or have seen others who have kind of drawn them up to say, hey, we're trying to integrate from point to point. And pretty quickly what that does is create the spider web or the rat's nest that you see on the left-hand side. And it really makes it hard for us to do things. When we had that environment that was all encapsulated within our data center and we had very few applications or sources of data, it was relatively easy to manage that point-to-point integration. But as we get to the much larger and wider sets of data, and even increasing as we look at streaming, we really need to have an architecture that has kind of a central hub where our information comes in and is able to come out. And this is what allows us to do that type of metadata collection and management and data lineage understanding that allows us to be successful. Inherent in data warehouse automation or automation techniques, we've found that organizations that have a strong practices and culture around automation are able to support 2.5 times more weekly change, if you will, than their counterparts who are doing it on a much more manual or less automated type of implementation strategy. And that's just kind of it makes sense. That's one of the reasons that you get into automation, is to be able to say, how do we support the changes that we're looking at? A lot of organizations say, hey, we've got this large backlog of information that we're trying to manage. How do we effectively move that backlog out and are able to maintain that? If you've got strong automation practices, you can have almost 2.5 times that change available to you. Also, one of the things that's very key to the way that we're looking at these things is, what are our successful outcomes? The whole point of implementing one of these projects isn't necessarily to create a technologically elegant environment. It is how are we able to meet the business outcomes of our business stakeholders. And that's what data-driven organizations are all about. They're not necessarily about, making sure that everything meets every dotted T and dotted I of a particular implementation architecture. They're focused on, does this help us lower our costs through operational efficiency or process improvement? And does this help us increase our revenues, either through the creation of a value-added product or in terms of being able to cross-sell, upsell, things of that nature, and have that value? For organizations we found that are applying automation techniques, they're twice as likely to have success in what they're doing. And then in terms of, once we get these things up and operating, we've talked about all the change on the front end. How are we going to maintain these environments. And we found that organizations that are using strong automation techniques are able to see a 35% decrease in their ongoing maintenance associated with that. So it's not just helping people get up and running at the beginning, but how do they maintain these environments that are going to see change in terms of data sources, change in terms of the analytical constraints that they're looking at it from those pieces. And I think these are keys that go very well into how we're trying to take a look at this. Now, what are the benefits of being able to apply these automation strategies to streaming data pipelines? You know, one of the things that we like to take a look at is how do we increase the scale and quality of our pipelines? Now, I'm being a little, I don't know if you want to say, comparing two different ends of the spectrum here, but if you look at the aqueducts that we used to create back in the Roman times, they were very effective. They would work really well, but it took them a really long time to build them, and it was things of that nature. Today, with these data pipelines, we're looking to be able to put together pipelines in a much quicker time frame to meet those change requirements we've talked a little bit about, and then to be able to scale that as we see these new environments come up, that we need to be able to address that. If you apply the two concepts that we looked at the beginning to say, hey, we've got over 10% of our folks are spending 40% of their time on data prep activities. If we're able to take that reduction of 35%, we're going to go from 40% down to a 25 to 30% amount of their time. And that's going to allow them to either spend more time doing that type of data engineering work where they can get into more environments to be able to, again, like I said, kind of claw through that backlog and get up and on top of it. Or it's going to allow those teams in a smaller organization to have more time to do the analysis and the other components that go with that. So if we're going to take these things together, we can go from about 40 to 25 to 30% of that time in those same environments. Now, if we look at terms of transformation and data prep, how are we looking at those components? You know, as we said, these folks were spending were able to do it in terms of one day. If we take that automation component and apply it in there, we're going to see even more improved productivity for those teams being able to handle more change quickly in those particular environments. But this really gives you an idea of how we can take some of those challenges that we saw before, use automation to make them better. Another area is in terms of machine learning and development. You know, we've got transformation, if you will, because not all models look for data the same way, and then we need to be able to process these models. We're seeing organizations that aren't just saying, hey, I want to see the results from a single model and say this is the answer. We're seeing organizations that are looking at 2, 3, or more models in parallel, picking the best of those, or to put them in series to be able to say, hey, let's pick the right one, right elements from this piece to be able to look for the advantages of the next stage, and to be able to do those together. You're seeing a lot of those things. Now, if we look at that concept to say, hey, we can be twice as successful with our automation strategies as we were before, and we look at it, the amount of change that this advanced analytics, machine learning types of environments require, we can either have the same level of success because we'll be doing, say, instead of 200 iterations, we're able to do it 100 iterations for that. We can do that in half the time, or what we can do is we can double the number of iterations that we're doing in a particular environment to be able to bring that up and running and say, hey, these are the things that we want to look for. Can we be looking at twice as many options? So I think that the automation techniques in terms of these changing requirements for analytics and machine learning and things of that nature really gives organizations the value to be able to build that out. Now, again, as I said, I've been working quite closely with Neil and his team for a while, and he's going to talk to you a bit about how does the team over at WhereScape really address some of the things that I've talked about from a domain perspective with their platform.
Thank you, John, and thanks everyone for taking the time to attend today's session. For those of you that may not be familiar with WhereScape, we've been around since 2002 and are really focused on data infrastructure automation, as John mentioned. So whether you're building a data warehouse, a data mart, a data vault, or maybe a data lake, and either on-premise in the cloud or what we're seeing from a lot of our customers today in a hybrid of those two environments, our software automates what you would say, the pain in the neck manual processes of developing, deploying, and eventually operating that infrastructure, allowing you to reduce the time, the cost, and the risk of building out your analytic environment. And with our recently released offering, WhereScape Automation for streaming, we can now help IT teams address the added complexity of managing a hybrid of streaming real-time and traditional batch-based data as those companies design, develop, and deploy, and then eventually operate their infrastructure. Again, speeding up the delivery and providing new analytic opportunities for those companies. So what's the value of infrastructure automation here? When applied to more traditional platforms and data sources, it's helped IT teams reduce their data warehouse lifecycle by 80% and allow them to boost their developer productivity 5 times compared to using previous manual methods for design, development, deployment, and operations. As a result, our customers have seen faster time to value for their investments and have successfully delivered their infrastructure projects with less resources and less cost in less time and with a lot more consistency and quality, which all of this then translates into less new project risk, longer-term maintainability as your development resources change over time. You've got consistent code, consistent practices, and allows them to also upskill and spin up resources in a much more efficient manner. And also, as the underlying infrastructure changes and needs, our tools are able to accommodate those changes within your platform. And what we see with today's demanding business environments, the IT teams are now looking to automation as a way to keep up with their business needs and deliver on time as their businesses now expect for them, or from them, I would say. So we've been, like I said, providing automation capabilities for 15 or 16 years now. We covered quite a number of different project types. Historically, we started out providing data warehouse and data marts on top of Oracle and SQL Server, and then we've extended our platforms now to cover quite a lot of database engines. We've also extended to other methodologies such as Data Vault, and then in the last few years, we've gone into doing a lot of cloud-based deployments and automation out into big data. And as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, we're seeing a lot more organizations actually doing a hybrid environment where they've got a legacy data warehouse on-premise, and maybe they want to deploy some new stuff up in the cloud. Our automation capabilities allow them to manage that environment as a single ecosystem, providing all the code generation, but also all the other extremely useful value that you get out of automation, documentation, lineage, impact analysis, things that are generally forgotten or certainly fall out of date relatively quickly if you're building by hand. What we've seen with a lot of our customers is that now that the business has got all this IoT, the sensor data, as John was talking about, now they want to start bringing that into their infrastructure and ingest it on a continual streaming fashion. And that was really the driver behind us extending our capabilities to now provide automation on top of streaming. A lot of our customers were really loving what they got out of their traditional batch-based world, and were asking for us to provide the same capabilities in this new streaming and real-time paradigm. So we've got, like we said, lots of different data sources, which are now bringing opportunity for organizations to gain real-time insight into the business trends, spot trouble spots from an operational perspective, and a lot more potential opportunity that begins to take shape. With that opportunity comes a rapid expectation from the business and the end users to actually get that data in as close to its time of being generated and provide them access to that for analytics. And what that does then, it allows other opportunities for organizations around things like machine learning and supply chain optimization, fraud detection, and all of that John alluded to earlier. So from a business standpoint, there's a lot of opportunity that's been made available from this. However, the challenge for IT has become pretty significant. How do we begin to integrate and leverage this data within their existing infrastructure? They've still got an existing data warehouse and existing environment, but they've also got a number of other obstacles that they need to address as part of this new paradigm. So for a lot of our companies, the business expects this data to come in and be processed, but the IT team doesn't actually get any more resources. They're already stretched doing their day-to-day operations. So how do they bring in all this new data and actually do that with their existing skill sets? The other one, assuming they can actually find new resources, actually the challenge of getting people with the appropriate skills and spinning them up. It's relatively easy in the traditional world to find people with skills in SQL, but finding resources that are knowledgeable with Kafka and Spark and Scala and all of these new open source technologies which are common within the streaming paradigm, those are much more difficult to find and retain. And then if you want to train people, it's a pretty steep learning curve. So how do we allow software automation technology to actually resolve this problem for the customers? The other one that we've seen frequently over the last few years is the pace of change in the technologies is pretty rapid. So how do I know that if I build something today on a set of technologies that I'm protected in 2 or 3 or 4 years when those underlying technologies may change or be replaced by something more efficient? Again, tools like ours which can abstract away from that infrastructure allow you to design and provide a level of comfort that should the technologies change over time, we can keep pace with that and deploy on newer technology. And going back to my earlier point, the streaming paradigm is new, but I also have an existing infrastructure in place with my enterprise data warehouse. Maybe I've got a data lake doing some other work. That stuff's not going away. So companies now have to integrate all of this into a single ecosystem. It provides quite a more complicated environment for IT teams to manage. And again, how do we leverage technology to take advantage of managing that complexity for me and resolve and reduce some of the overhead for the IT people? And for us, we're all about managing both batch and streaming. Like I said, for 15 or 16 years, we've been living in the batch world and managing all of that for companies. But we see the streaming world is important for a lot of our customers, but the critical aspect is actually managing both as a single ecosystem. More easily manage everything as a single environment rather than siloed systems. We can have metadata that spans both batch and streaming, which is important from a governance standpoint from the business. I can provide data lineage, usage information, impact analysis, track back, track forward across all of my ecosystem as opposed to just a single area, and allows companies to actually incorporate some of the data that may reside within their EDW. It may incorporate that as part of their streaming processing to enrich incoming streams with additional data, all of that sort of good stuff. So it's particularly valuable for companies that want to persist stream-based data into their data infrastructure, especially if you want to start combining streaming data with batch-based data residing in your existing data warehouse, or blend that as part of the processing, which for a lot of our organizations is quite a common expectation and requirement. So a good example here is one of our customers, a long-term customer of WhereScape, which is Clever Devices just out of New York. They've been using us for a number of years to provide automation on their traditional batch-based data warehouse environment, and they love the capabilities that the automation tool provides in terms of development, deployment, and obviously documentation and lineage and impact analysis. But they are being pushed by their customers to actually augment their data warehouse with real-time analytics and ingestion of real-time data from sensors out in the field. So they came to us and were wondering, how can we take this automation capability that we love in the batch-based world and actually translate that to the streaming world? So we've been working with them to now augment their data warehouse to include both a combination of batch and streaming data, so they can actually turn around and meet the demanding needs of their customers around providing real-time analytics. No longer is a 24-hour lag in the data acceptable. The customers want to see it within 15, 30 seconds of it actually happening. So that's been a good value add for them from providing automation both batch and streaming. So where does WhereScape fit in this sensor, the streaming ecosystem? So from a sensors and IoT devices out in the field, landing data into a system such as Kafka as an example, we pick up the data from that entry point, and then we'll actually do all of the in-flight processing and any necessary transformation on that data and then persist it into whatever relevant data store or data stores that you want. So we can write into a database. You can put it out into an object store like S3 or Azure Data Lake store. Maybe you want to put it into Mongo or something like that, or in the cloud. So we can persist the data in any number of those platforms, and then you can access it from your traditional data warehousing, dashboard reporting tools. Maybe you've got some data science tools. They can then access that data and process it and get their value add and business value from that. If we step back, where does WhereScape fit from the technology stack area? We're all about automation. So in the traditional world, we did automation, and then we pushed down all of the logic to the database engine to do ELT. We're going to, again, stick to what we're good at, which is automating data pipelines. And what we've done as part of the streaming offering is we've actually partnered with StreamSets based out of San Francisco, and we will actually do the automation and construction of data pipelines that we then submit to StreamSets, and then they do what they are good at, which is the actual pipeline execution, and we can monitor and manage through that. It allows us to build data pipelines much faster and then integrate with best-of-breed tools like StreamSets to do the actual execution of those pipelines. So again, the capabilities around automation streaming comes back to, from a business standpoint, full lifecycle management, so all the way from discovery. So we can point our tool at Kafka, for example, and actually discover what topics are in the Kafka cluster. And if you actually want to get structure for a particular topic, to John's earlier point, with things like JSON being a fairly frequent or fairly common data formats, we can actually interrogate those topics. And if you want to understand the structure of those topics, actually go and read the data and determine the structure based on the data that's in there. From that, you can then design the pipelines that you want through our user interface, and I'll show that to you in a few minutes. And then we will actually generate the pipelines and then execute them, and then you can monitor and manage them, managing the full life cycle, so that in a couple of months, if you want to change the pipeline, you can actually go back into our tool, make the necessary changes to the pipeline, and redeploy it. So we're offering full life cycle management, which allows you to ease the ongoing burden of managing this data infrastructure, and then get the value of a metadata-based design tool, which is things like documentation is always kept up to date. Because, if you're building it by hand, you're probably not going to do documentation, and even if you do documentation, it's going to fall out of date quickly. But we provide full documentation. Again, with metadata-based stuff, we can do things like impact analysis and track back and track forward diagrams to show you, where the data is being used and who it's being accessed and used by. So a lot of extremely valuable governance-based capabilities that are just out of the box as part of the automation tool. So what I want to do here, if I can follow the technology, is actually give you just a quick demo and give you an idea of what our tool can do. Hopefully we can share my tool. So I'm just going to log into our product. And so what I've done prior to this demo is actually created I've got two connections. I've got a connection to a Kafka cluster that I've got some transit data residing in. And I've created a connection to a SQL Server data warehouse as an example. So what I want to do is actually show you the automation of a capability of building a very simple set of data vault structures, and show you how the tool can take the source structure and then, based on a series of wizards and metadata and best practices around a data vault design, actually construct a fairly complicated data flow and do that in a very efficient time frame. So what I'm going to do is go over to our design palette and just create a new data flow. So we'll call it transit feed. And what you'll notice is we get a palette-based design area. And then I'm just going to switch over to connections. And what I did prior to this, just to speed up some of the areas, is I went and discovered our Kafka cluster, and I just pulled out 3 topics on there. We've got one containing a vehicle location. So for a particular vehicle out in the field, what's this, based on a point in time, it's latitude, longitude, speed, and a whole pile of other information around that particular device, and then routes and trips as to where that particular bus is actually going within this particular route. So what I want to do is just bring that onto my palette. So I'm going to include that as part of my data vault. Something on routes. We'll just free up some space here. Okay. And then, so one of the things we've done as part of the discovery of the topics is we can actually go and discover the JSON structure, and then based on the structure, we can automatically determine a schema for that. For the data vault, I actually want a schema defined up front, so we do that here. One of the other interesting things we can do is, in the relational world, you've got referential integrity, so based on foreign keys now, we can establish relationships between entities. In the case where you don't have foreign keys in a database, or in this example, I've got Kafka, I can actually go and manually define a relationship. So I can say that, route ID here, and then I can join it to route ID on my routes table and actually create a relationship in our metadata that defines how certain entities are related. And what that allows us to do when we're building out our automated pipeline is use those relationships to pre-construct joins and relationships and through the various steps. So once I've got those relationships done, I actually don't need to set those anywhere else. If I created another pipeline using these two entities, the relationship would already be predefined and automatically show up. So what I want to do is just create a very simple data vault. Again, if you're not familiar with data vault, you don't need to worry about too much. What you really want to do is understand how the wizards are asking you questions based on the data vault methodology, and then based on the answers you provide, we'll actually go and construct the relevant data pipelines. So here I'm going to create a data vault, and it's just telling me what my steps are. Then as I step through, I can specify where I want to land this data. So I'm going to specify my single connection and put it as a DBO schema. One of the things with stream-based pipelines is you can actually have one pipeline persisting data into multiple different data stores. So you could have it being persisted into a database and also a data lake at the same time. So once I've decided where my steps are, what the tool's doing here on the palette, as you'll see, is I've got the routes and vehicle location, which are my two incoming sources, is the tool's now working me through the methodology for building a data vault and using best practices recommending certain structures. So for AT vehicle location and routes, it knows that I probably want to create a link off of vehicle location and a hub off of routes. But I can actually, where I want, override it. So I could create an additional hub if I wanted. It's just a simple one here. I'm just going to change the name of the link that I want to create, call it link vehicle location. Then we just hit next. And then I want to flag the business keys. So I'll click on my link, and it's already defaulted the route ID based on that relationship I created, but I know there's two other attributes here, trip ID and vehicle ID, so I'll just set those. And then if I go to the routes hub, it's already specified the route ID as my business key, again, based off of the relationship we created earlier. I can change it if I want. I know it's actually right, so I'm just going to leave it. And then the next step is adding relationships between links and hubs. So in this scenario where I hadn't predefined the relationship up front, or part of our discovery hadn't discovered the relationship, I could actually manually specify or override relationships between entities here. I'm just going to step through it. And then satellites. So in the data vault world, satellites are where you store all of your descriptive information. Again, it defaults the satellite you want to create. If I want to add additional satellites, I can actually go and do that. We'll just leave them as is just to simplify this exercise. But again, the wizard's defaulting based on the methodology, and we can actually step in and manually change if we wish to. And then on each satellite, you can specify which attributes from that source come in here. In the data vault world, the business keys go and live in the links, while the remaining attributes go and live in the satellite. So it's left vehicle ID, trip ID, and route ID as blank because they're not needed or not stored in the satellites. And then on the route satellite, you see route ID is actually not stored there. So once I've done that, my design, so I've got my Kafka source and I've got my target structures. I've got the structures defined and they look good. So I'm actually going to go and hit create. And what that's going to do here is take all of that metadata that we've defined about relationships and what's a business key, and what it's going to do is actually construct a pipeline that takes that into account, as well as adding in all the additional best practices of a data vault. So there would be things like change keys and hash keys and additional metadata attributes around load date and record source. Where did the data come from? When did it come into the system? So it's going to construct all the additional attributes and the data pipelines for the data vault. So it's just churning away here. Now, if we had to build this manually by hand, you could certainly do it, but it takes a lot longer. So now, traditional batch-based data vault environment, it's significant orders of magnitude quicker to do it through our automation technologies. What we're doing here is applying the same best practices and methodologies. They're building it on top of a streaming-based paradigm as opposed to a batch-based ELT paradigm. So at that point, I've got a data pipeline configured. Let me just search. Oh, I have the refresh button. Sorry about that. So we've got a data flow here. I can actually just simplify that. The pallette's now showing me everything in the data flow. I can actually go and filter out some of the stuff just to hide some of the noise. So what we see here is a data pipeline between the various entities. So we can see how the data comes from routes and goes through. But we can also actually explode it out and see what the attributes are and where they came from. So let me just zoom in here on the satellite for routes. The ones that are highlighted in yellow, so H key, hash routes, change key, load date, record source, those are actually automatically added as part of the data vault methodology. So those are all done out of the box for you. And then the diagram is actually showing me my track back and my lineage about where attributes are going and coming from. So I've got all of that capability here. Once I've designed it, now if we wanted to actually deploy that to my cluster and have it running, we can actually export that. And hopefully I'll type in the right name. So here we're pointing where we want to deploy this particular streaming pipeline. And then one of the long-term value propositions of WhereScape is we manage the full life cycle of an environment. So in this case, I've got database tables. Now, WhereScape will actually go and manage the creation of those tables within the database platform. So we've gone and executed that, and those hub sets and link tables we created have actually gone and been constructed in my target SQL Server database. So that's taken care of for me. Then I can go and actually upload the pipeline. In this case, it's taking that metadata, constructing the stream sets data flow pipeline, and then loading it up into stream sets. So it'll just take a few seconds to do that. And then once it's uploaded the pipeline into stream sets, we can actually go and start it from here. So we can manage the full life cycle. I don't need to jump out into another tool. I can actually go and start the pipeline. And assuming I didn't fat finger anything, they should start up and they should be off and running. And then we can keep an eye on them. We can monitor them from here. And then actually, if you want, actually stop them from here as well. So they're off and running. So at a very high level, that's a very quick overview of how we can take automation, best practices and methodologies, certain use cases and processing paradigms, and have the tool construct a fairly complicated pipeline based on that, and then deploy it and operate it and manage it. And then when I want to go and enhance it, I can go back into that pipeline and make the necessary changes. So just finishing up before I hand back to John here. Again, hopefully you got a quick overview of how our automation capabilities can really manage both the full life cycle of an environment, whether it's batch and, in this case, streaming, and how we can speed up the development of the pipelines and accelerate that time to production, right? That time to value for the business. How do I take an idea or a need to have and get it into production as soon as possible? And we can hide a lot of the complexity here, right? We hide the complexity of Spark and Kafka, and we hide the complexity of building a data vault methodology by building that within our tool. Gets you nice, consistent, repeatable, robust code. And again, it's all fully documented. So all of this is in metadata. Now I can go back and look at the documentation, do the lineage and impact analysis, and really understand where and how I'm using my data within my entire ecosystem, streaming and batch. So hopefully that's given you a quick overview of our streaming capabilities. And at this point, I'll hand back to John.
Yep. So, just trying to wrap up what Neil was talking about, and he provided a lot of great insights there, particularly about how you're able to use not just, say, a more traditional type of schema of hub or spoke, but how to use the new ones like a data vault with a platform like WhereScape, and to manage a lot of those pieces. I've gone through the certification process for that, and that piece that you showed about automating is one of the hardest things for those modelers to get correct. But where do we go from here? Streaming success is going to be built on agility and quality to be able to do that. The agility is because by nature, it's got a lot of changes that are coming through the data and a lot of changes that people are going to want to have in those environments. And the quality part is going to be because if we don't build the trust in those initial environments, people are going to have issues with the data as it's being presented. Next, automation expands the bandwidth and the success of different organizations. If you're trying to do all these things by hand, I'm not saying that you can't do it, but that's going to take a team of superheroes that know everything that they're talking about, as Neil described, and finding those resources, particularly outside of the Silicon Valley area, is going to be difficult, and building those teams is going to be hard. So how do you take automation and really expand your organization's knowledge base, bandwidth, and success? And if you're going to take streaming and automation and put them together, you're going to be able to manage these new data sources, these new architectures that you're going to have, and be able to meet the requirements of your business stakeholders. So, I think this all brings us to a great end here. Raleigh, I know we've got some questions from our participants, and just thought we'd hand it back to you.
Great. Thank you, John. As a reminder, you can log your questions either via the ReadyTalk platform, or you can submit your questions or comments. Again, feel free to even do that after this event using the Twitter handles and hashtags listed here. So jumping into the questions, starting with you, Neil, can Kafka be used as a target?
Good question, yes. We see that as a very common scenario where people are building pipelines, consuming from Kafka, doing some processing, maybe some anomaly detection, and then writing it back to Kafka, and then have a separate data flow somewhere else that is consuming from that other topic. So, absolutely, we can support that. One data flow writing to a Kafka topic, which subsequently consumed by something else. And a scenario we expect to be fairly common.
Great. And does a data flow have to write to the same target platform?
No. You can actually, my simple example had it writing everything into SQL Server, but we could certainly have that same data flow writing some subset of objects into SQL Server, maybe some subset into Hive, and you could also have that raw stream coming off of Kafka being persisted out into a data lake. You can do multiple different platforms all within a single pipeline.
Excellent. And this attendee wants to know, Neil, with WhereScape Red, there is a desktop tool for building workflows. Does this web interface replace that, or is this specifically for streaming?
This is specifically for streaming at this point. So the existing Red tool continues as is, and this will do the streaming stuff.
Great, thank you. Jumping over to you, John, are there particular industries that focus on streaming implementations? What are you seeing?
As part of our end user research, we're finding that this is going pretty much across most industries now. Ones that have connected fleet, so we're talking about package delivery, supply chain types of organizations. It's relatively easy for them to get up and running because they can retrofit, if you will, the trucks or the delivery vans. But we're seeing organizations go all the way down to, say, in the construction industry. When I heard this use case, I was pretty flabbergasted. They're putting GPS and temperature sensors on construction workers so that they can understand where they are on a work site and whether or not they're at risk for either frostbite if it's too cold. If you've ever worked construction in the state of Colorado in December, or if it gets too hot, if you've ever worked construction in Arizona in the summertime. But these are areas that you might have thought it's manufacturing, or that is where we're looking at IoT. No, we're seeing it go across the board, particularly in those industries that are, if you will, born of data or data native.
And John, who are the champions of streaming projects programs?
We're finding that a lot of the folks that are the champions of these programs are folks from the operations side of the house. These are the guys that have had the most experience implementing, whether if you're looking at utilities, putting pipe in the ground, putting wire in the sky, things of that nature. You're seeing it also from, say, the warehouse perspective of how do we track the inventory and how do we make that better, faster, stronger, as well as how do we meet our SLAs for delivery for those fulfillments. So a lot of times we're seeing it come from the operations side because, one, they're interacting with these devices, and two, they get a lot of value out of the process and operational improvement.
Great, thank you. The next question, I'll start with you, Neil, but John, I know you have a lot of knowledge on projects too, so maybe you can give us your thoughts as well. But starting with you, Neil, what is the biggest challenge being encountered by companies you're engaged with?
Yeah, sure. I think certainly for a lot of our companies that our existing customers and some of the prospects we talk to, their biggest challenge is finding the skills in this environment, and also, like I said earlier, having the bandwidth to do it. They're already fully burdened doing regular day-to-day stuff. So how do they work? How do they get resources to do this new streaming stuff? And then the long-term manageability. One of the key value propositions of our existing product is consistent code and repeatability allows you to maintain it over the long run. And we see the same challenges and, from our standpoint, opportunity for the streaming paradigm.
And Raleigh, to add on to that, I think we're seeing a lot of organizations that are, as they've gotten into streaming types of environments, they've kind of had to go like each step of the maturity curve. What it sounds to me like what the WhereScape team is really going to be able to do is to help people accelerate through some of those earlier stages and get to those later stages where organizations can be much more into the realm of predictive maintenance or understanding real-time information from customers and things of that nature, to be able to move that along much more quickly as opposed to having to do each individual step of maturity from both a data collection, a data pipelining, each of those sections. This allows you to streamline that and spend more of your time on the business outcomes than you would on, say, the technical infrastructure.
That's great. Thank you both for your insight. That brings us to the top of the hour, so I'm going to conclude today's event. I wanted to thank everyone for taking time out of your schedule to join us. And as a reminder, you will be receiving a follow-up email from EMA that will include resources from today's event. I do hope that you will check that out, and I hope that we'll see you at a future event. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Good day, everyone.